if we want to start it off, if you could just introduce yourself and tell everybody, who you are and what you do, we can get into it that way.
I love that. That sounds great. Well, hello. I am Rosie Grant, and I research recipes on gravestones.
This is your second time on the podcast. Let's first get to that point. This is very exciting. I think you're my first repeat guest,
Whoa. Okay, I'm honored.
which is very exciting. Yeah, I think I looked it up. I think it's like almost 2 years exactly. I think April
Whoa.
of 2023 is when you were on the podcast last time. So I mean, we usually will like message back and forth, reacting to stuff that we post, online or whatever. But I don't know what it was, but for whatever reason, I just saw something you posted and I was like, we need to have Rosie back on the podcast. And I just sent you a message and we're like, we set it up. And then I just happened to look and yeah, so it's like 2 years exactly, which is very exciting. I think I mean, I'm assuming it was TikTok. I saw one
Mhm.
of your TikToks, and that's like why I initially reached out. You're on the internet, going all over the place to these different cemeteries, and you're pulling recipes off of gravestones, and you're telling all of these people's stories, which is so cool. You have a book that you're working on, right? That's
Mhm.
very exciting. I want to hear so much more about that. But for anybody that maybe didn't catch your first episode, anyone that's new that's listening, we could maybe do a little bit of a refresher. But we do start every episode the same way. So let's get that out of the way, and then I obviously have some questions that I think will help people learn a little bit about yourself and what you do. But um, what is your relationship with death like? Are you thinking about it a lot? Is it something that worries you? Do you think about it every day? What do you feel like? And maybe even from 2 years ago, has your relationship with death changed at all in the past couple of years?
Yeah, I love that you start with that question. I have to, yeah, I'm curious. I'm trying to remember what I had said last time. It probably is pretty similar in the sense that I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
Uh, I think I have still kind of mixed feelings about my own mortality and my loved one's mortality. But being in a process, especially as like a death positive content creator, has made it a lot easier. Following accounts such as yours has also made it a lot easier of like it's something that unifies everyone.
Mm.
And so talking about it and thinking about it and like kind of embracing it has made me a lot more comfortable with it.
I think that's sort of the trick, right? And it's kind of a hard trick because nobody wants to think about their, friends and family dying. No one especially wants to think about the fact that they're going to die. But for
Mm.
whatever reason, that makes it easier. Thinking about it and talking about it really does help so much. I mean, I've said this on the podcast before, but it's like I've unfortunately lost some friends in the past 2.5, 3 years, and you know, a lot of it happened all at once, and it was, a lot of it was very, out of nowhere. Very, nobody was really prepared for it, and of course, it was hard, but I really feel like I was able to deal with it so like on just like on a different level than a lot of my friends, unfortunately, and I was able to be there for a lot of my friends because I'm sort of
Mm.
always talking about it and thinking about it, and I'm so lucky to have these conversations. It's not that I think it's pretty rare that somebody is, I'm coming up on 5 years now of doing this. So it's like, so,
Wow.
it's like, I don't know, once, at least twice a month for an hour, I'm talking to somebody that I'm usually just meeting for the first time about death. So, I mean, I mean, I don't know, it's such an interesting way to sort of live my life. And I really think it helps a ton. It really does. But you try and tell that to people sometimes and they don't get it or it's just too scary or whatever. I
Yep.
I have an episode that's coming out later this month. I interviewed this woman who's dealing with end stage heart failure right now.
Wow.
And she was telling some of her friends, she's like, "Oh, I got invited." You know, she's on TikTok. She has an LVAD, so it's, this machine that keeps her heart pumping.
Oh
And
my
so
God.
she's on TikTok and she's like talking about it and showing people and, explaining like how she lives her life with this machine. And she was telling some of her friends, she's like, "Oh, I've been making these videos. I got invited on this podcast." And her friends were like, "Oh, that's so cool. You're going to be on a podcast." And she's like, "Yeah, it's called Obsessed with Death." And all of her friends were just like, what?" Like just did not expect that to be, you know, so I don't know. It's tough. Not everybody gets it, but that's okay. My point, this long ramble that I'm going on here is, I think what you're doing would have to help, right? You're constantly around death in different ways. This is probably something we talked about in the other episode, but I'm still, curious to hear more about it, which is like, where did the curiosity come from? How do you end up at a cemetery and then decide, I found a recipe. I'm going to go home and make that now. Like, where did all of that come from?
Yeah, gosh, it's, I guess, kind of like what you were even saying of like, it's just so around us. And first of all, I'm so sorry to hear about your losses in the last 2 years.
Oh,
I'm
thank you.
glad
Yeah.
talking about it and being in such an open space has really been helpful for even just supporting your friend groups, and
Yeah.
that's so real. For me with it, it was I always had liked cemeteries. Like I grew up next to one, like the my high school where it was in Alexandria, Virginia. I would walk through a cemetery on my way home because that was like the shortcut. And I've always found the cemeteries near me were always like very open to people walking through. And, as long as you're respectfully, minding the space,
Sure.
very open to people just kind of like visiting and like enjoying the gravestones and trees and whatever. And my parents
Yeah.
are both ghost tour guides, so that also helps. And that my dad loves history. We like
Yes, that's
grew
right.
up going to lots of ghost tours, whether in Virginia or in DC or pretty much anywhere we traveled growing up, we would take a ghost tour guide. Just because like it was like ghost tours are such a fun way to like get the interesting parts of history. And it's always like it made history a lot less dry. And often they would take us through a cemetery. So I would say like that was the like enjoyable historical side of like the death industry. And then I
Yeah.
didn't myself get really aware of all of the inner workings until I interned at a cemetery in my master's in library science. And so I had to get an archives internship. I It was during the pandemic, and so everywhere was closed. And so the
Yeah.
only place that was bringing in new people was cemeteries in my area, and I wanted something in person, and the cemetery was very flexible with my like class schedule and work schedule. And so even though I interned there as a matter of just it was the opportunity that fit the bill, I'm so grateful for this internship. And everyone at Congressional Cemetery where I interned was just so welcoming and so patient with me being very new to the death industry and how it works, how cemetery archives works. And so that was the TikTok had started specifically about my cemetery internship. And then eventually I just was endlessly curious. There were so many interesting memorials and ways that people wanted to be celebrated in death. So I expanded beyond my own cemetery and then eventually beyond DC. And that was where the first gravestone recipe came out of um, hearing about this woman named Naomi who had a spritz cookie recipe on her gravestone in Brooklyn. And now, a few years later, so I think this is what, 2021, years later, I'm at 45 gravestone recipes, and I visited all but two, no, excuse me, all but four. There's two more I'm going to go visit actually in 2 weeks. And so lots of talking with these families now that I have enough. So it's going to be, yes, a cookbook is what's being put together right now.
Yeah.
And I am excited I feel like I've barely scratched the surface on learning about like food and memory and death and kind of how it all connects together.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm like jotting down notes as you're talking. There's so many things I want to I want to mention. But first of all, so jealous that you lived next to a cemetery. I was always so
Oh,
jealous. Like, I mean, I didn't know anybody that growing up that lived next to one, but you'd like see it in
mm.
movies and stuff, right? You'd
Oh
see
yeah.
people, and I was always so jealous of that. I don't know why, especially when I was younger. I wasn't like into cemeteries or anything, but I
Mm,
always thought it was such a cool, like it was just like it seemed like a cool place to live by. I don't know how to explain it, but
mhm.
I was always so jealous.
No,
And
exactly that.
yeah, and being able to like your that's your shortcut home is incredible. I love that. I'm also kind of curious. You mentioned obviously your parents were ghost tour guides, which is so cool. But I would like when you were a kid, did that just like I don't know, I feel like when you're a kid like you're scared of everything like ghosts are scary. Like was that just like
Mm.
non-existent to you? Was were do you remember like being afraid of anything like paranormal as a kid or was it just always like just a normal like family thing?
It's so funny you asked that because I have been doing a lot of rethinking of my own childhood.
Hmm.
Maybe it's just a thing when you get older,
Yeah.
but I had always thought of my childhood as so normal because my parents, I should say, the ghost tour guide thing was something they did in retirement. They both worked for the
Okay.
government when I was younger, so they had very normal jobs. We lived in the suburbs of DC, and I always just thought I had like the most boring normal childhood. And
Hmm.
I mean, it was a great childhood. I'm so grateful for it, but I never thought we did anything that weird. And yes, we did go do ghost tours, and mostly because they were like they always had fun storytellers and stuff. So I never thought much about that. But I have some friends who are very like sensitive, like they'll walk into a house and pick up on vibes.
Yeah.
And I never felt that way. But my mom says, like recently, she's been commenting. She's like, when you were a kid, you were so sensitive to things. You were scared of everything.
Hmm.
So she remembers us going on these ghost tours and me getting scared by it. If I saw something scary on TV, I would like want to sleep in my parents' room, or I shared a room when I was like a little kid. I shared it with my two brothers. So all three of us were in one room.
Yeah.
And eventually they moved me onto my own bedroom. And I wanted to sleep in the boys' room because I was like scared of
Yeah.
house. And as adults, my mom was like, oh, by the way, like the previous owner of our house in Virginia had died in the kids' room. Like he was smoking and his cigarette, he, fell and taken a nap. The cigarette caught fire
Oh
and
wow.
the room burned down. And so this was the kids' room. And so she was like, I always wondered if the reason why you would have like these night terrors, like every night as a kid, was something like connected to that. Cause like you were so scared of everything and you're always like, heightened sensitivity. And now as an adult, I feel like I've like pared down on it. So I like go out of my way to like bubble myself. And like people are always like, do you feel energies when you walk into cemeteries? And I'm like, I don't feel anything. But
Yeah.
my mom was like, that's maybe like a protection thing for yourself, even if you don't realize you're doing it.
Yeah, because I mean, it just makes me think like, I mean, growing up when you're little, there's so many things are terrifying. And,
Yeah.
just I remember as a kid, like just having nightmares and just like waking up and thinking it's real or whatever, you know,
Yes.
even just like the cliche, like, monsters under your bed, like that, all that stuff's real. Like I remember being
Mhm.
terrified of my closet at points in my
Yes.
just like I still I'll come home sometimes I'll still check my shower, make sure
Oh my
nobody's in
God,
there.
me too.
It's just like I don't know if I'll do it for the rest of my life, I'm sure,
Yeah.
but you're just like getting exposed to all of this stuff so young. I would think it would either make you just like more heightenedly aware and terrified of everything, or you end up writing a gravestone recipe cookbook. So
You embrace it. That's the direction we decided to take.
yeah, absolutely. I am curious about the book. I want to get into it a little bit. I think it's obviously such an interesting way to create a cookbook. Did anything like this exist before? Are there other gravestone recipe books, or is this like a new thing?
It's a great question. There have been like Atlas Obscura is a really great resource in general if people haven't heard of it. It's basically like I don't know, you could almost think of it as like Yelp for the interesting things around you.
Okay.
It's basically a crowdsourced world map that has like been curated and like thoughtfully edited. And you can basically go into the map version and you can look around you of like, or if you're traveling somewhere, they have like curated maps for like pretty much every place on the planet.
Yeah.
And you'll like look like what are interesting things near me, and it'll have like an editorial piece about like what's something interesting. And it's not going to be like in DC, it's not going to be like all of Smithsonian or the White House, but it'll be like this cornerstone has this really unusual history to it or something, or this one brick. Be on the lookout for this thing. And so they have lots of cemetery stories and lots of cemetery history. So the very first one that I had learned about was from Atlas Obscura, and that was Naomi's recipe. And there were three, no, maybe like up to five. There were quite a few around the world of gravestone recipes and other, again, interesting cemetery stories and memorials. So that was how I'd first kind of, that was like my foray into it. There
Yeah.
was a zine. So someone who I think had put together, she had submitted some of these gravestone recipes onto Atlas Obscura. She had written a few different ones and she had put together, I think it used to be sold on Etsy. And it was like a zine of like the 10 that she knew about. And it was great. I bought the zine. I wish I had found the zine, like I had known about it earlier in the process, because I
Mhm.
feel like I went down a lot of rabbit holes. And then when I learned about the zine, I was like, oh, this someone's already like put a few of these together. From my understanding, they didn't like it was like literally a few. It was more of like a fun crowdsourced project than anything else.
Yeah.
So the big goal with this has been less finding them and more getting permissions from the families and getting the stories from the families and like learning how to recreate the recipe from their own like personal family cooking and history and that sort of thing. And so that's been the biggest part of this whole project has been 45 families and you know everyone again being in different processes of grief
Yeah.
and that there's every single family has been completely different, every person's been very different. And so like when I'm first reaching out to all these poor people and being like, hi, so I have this project and you know I just think it's so cool you have this for your loved one. What do you think about including them and making sure I've been going based off of like community archive principles and ethics of like making sure they have all the information as much as I have it up front,
Mhm.
making sure that they know that they don't have to opt into this. Like they have, if they're like, you know, we'll think about it and we'll get back to you. There's no timeline on grief. There's no,
Yeah.
like me having a deadline for my own editing and book is great on my end, but they should not be adhered to deadlines. Like, you know, I don't want to be like, okay, get me all this information in a month. Like that doesn't exist. And
Yeah.
so trying to be really thoughtful, give them as much time as I possibly can. And then just really relaying expectations to the editor to be like, you know, they're on their own timeline. Hopefully they'll get back to me by not. And if not, we're going to have to extend this deadline to give them enough processing as possible. And yeah, some families will like within 24 hours will be like, here's the edit signed off. This looks great. We're so excited. And then one family, like, for instance, they took 2 years to think about it. They're like,
Wow.
and I would check in every 6 months to be like, hey, like, what are your thoughts on being included? And they're like, we're still thinking, like, you know, we'll talk to you later.
Yeah.
And eventually they did sign off. Only one family officially did not sign off on it. And I think, again, grief has its own take and it's like their own personal family story. So they were like very kindly and very politely, we're just like, you know, thank you for reaching out and we think we'll pass. And like, that's amazing. So that's really been the full process of getting into these like recipes to be featured.
Yeah, I mean that was something that I was really curious about was that the the approach that you take to reaching out to these families and seeing what that process would be like, and it sounds like you figured out the most appropriate way of doing that. What was it like pitching the book? Was that difficult? Like what was the process like trying to pitch a cookbook? I mean, I feel like I've never pitched a book before. I feel like there's obviously a lot of cookbooks out there, and I would assume a lot of
Mm.
people pitching cookbooks. Food is, obviously it's always been a thing. I remember, watching cooking shows as a child, like Julia Childs and I think food has become such a popular thing now. There's with YouTube obviously and TikTok and everything. There's got to be so many people pitching, these different ideas for cookbooks. What was it like pitching your idea? How did that whole process go?
Yeah, honestly, the pitch was one of the easier things once I had enough recipes, once I like knew of enough recipes.
Hmm.
It was honestly kind of a random. I had done I did a paranormal podcast.
Hmm.
And I don't feel like I have like personally a lot of like spooky stories, but talking about my friend who is sensitive, she and I had this one kind of silly, funny story that we pitched to a podcast called Otherworld. And Jack Wagner, the host, had just signed on with a management company, and some of his other guests who have like truly wild, wild stories. They were in the process of assigning them to a UTA management company or a book agent, basically.
Yeah.
And so they were like, oh, by the way, and I should say my story had nothing to do with Gravestone recipes. I didn't even bring it up in the interview.
Mhm.
But at the very end, Jack goes, are you the Gravestone recipes girl? And I was like, yeah, how do you know? And he's like, people keep sending me memes of you. And I was like, oh, that's so silly. So in any case, he had put two and two together and pitched me to UTA. And we had a meeting, and basically they helped me with the book pitch. And in the beginning, like I was getting, from time to time, maybe a few times a month, a random book editor would reach out being like, hey, would you be interested in doing a cookbook on this? And in the beginning, I was like, I have like 5 recipes. Like, I don't think I have enough. And then I had
Mhm.
10. And then around 10 is when I met my first family. Because in my mind, I was like, I can't really do this without, like, if I can get all of the families to agree, great. But like, I can't imagine that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then I basically around 20 recipes, I had connected to 5 or 6 of the families, and they were really excited. And they had brought up, you have enough recipes. Maybe would this be of interest? And so I think when we had talked, I guess I was in the pitching process, but pretty much this time a year ago, I had signed off. So like, we put together a pitch of like, I know of about 25 recipes, and I'm hoping to really aggressively like go all in on looking, and I could maybe get 40 recipes. And we put together like a perspective, like it could kind of be like this. And like the amount of leaps of faith and Hail Mary throws that we've put to this of like, basically like all of the publishers we met with were like, we need 40 recipes and all of the families to sign off. And
Mm.
I was like, I cannot imagine that's going to happen, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm like, if nothing else, this forces me, because like I had been wanting to reach out to the families. So we signed off. I signed with HarperCollins. And the main reason why I signed with them, like obviously they're an incredible publishing company.
Yeah.
But like, between them and Simon and Schuster and some of the other publishing companies, all the other editors I was talking to wanted a very traditional cookbook of like, yeah, we're imagining like 100 recipes and not really that much of the stories. Like, we don't really care about that. Versus HarperCollins
Mhm.
was like, I want like this, like in addition to a recipe, I want who is the person behind the recipe. And like, it's this story of food legacy and like, being remembered after you die for, more than just what's on your gravestone, which is usually like mother, father, or like a job title or some accolade.
Yeah.
But like work that goes into community building around cooking and home and serving others through food. And so she had really understood the kind of like spirit of it. So that's why I went with her. And then, yeah, pretty much last year was like we signed it in the spring, and I just went full mode into like reaching out to everybody. I was contacting these poor people's random nieces and cousins and like coworkers. And I kept expecting, I mean, some of these people took months to get back to me, but once we got on the phone and started talking, everyone has been so lovely. They've been so kind and so generous in this process. And it definitely, like, after the first like 10 or so interviews, very much encouraged me to kind of keep pushing forward. And so, yeah, now I know of 45 recipes, and I've gotten 39 signed off on.
Wow.
So we'll see if I can get the final one. But I'm not particularly worried, just because I'm like, this is amazing. I can't believe we're here.
It blows my mind that some of these other publishers would want to do a cookbook like this, but not include anything about the people.
Right?
Like,
Yeah, they're
what's
like,
the
that's
point of the
not
like?
interesting. And I'm like, we don't have a project.
Yeah, like I mean, it's still a cool idea, obviously. Like, oh, these recipes are
Sure.
from very specific people, and it's from a gravestone, and this obviously meant a lot to them. And yes, I get that
Yeah,
part of it, but to not include like, I want to know. I would want to know everything about
exactly.
every person. That just is crazy to me.
I feel the same. And also, like, in order to get permission and sign off from the families, like, they're going into their loved ones' stories. Each person honestly could have like a whole biography about them. It's just the
Yeah.
idea that like every human being is so interesting, and like has made an impact, even if they didn't have some fancy thing, or like they were a homemaker or like a mom. It's a lot of like mothers and grandmothers
Mm,
who I think have like just lived the coolest lives. And like it's been incredible kind of going through these journeys and seeing photos of them as a young person, and like seeing whatever their life trajectory was and like what was important to them. And so to have all of these stories being told and to not include it on some level, and like, at the end of the day, this is still a cookbook. And so like, while some of these people I've interviewed for hours, and it'll be pretty much 1 to 2 pages about each of them. But I'm hoping to be able to do more storytelling even beyond the cookbook, just because I'm like, golly, these people are all so cool.
yeah.
Now, on the plus side of having 40 recipes, it also allows us to really be flexible with what we kind of like, what narrative we take for this cookbook.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier, there's something to be said about there are so many cookbooks out there. What I
Yeah.
really like that the editor has allowed me to do with this one is to, like, the average cookbook's at least 100 recipes. And so, I don't know if you're familiar with Amy Bruni, and she does like, I think she was like on Ghost Hunters. And she last year wrote a fabulous cookbook called Food to Die For.
Mhm.
And basically, she went to all these like haunted locations and picked out recipes that were like associated with them. And I think she does a really good example of like, she has probably 40, 45 recipes in hers. There's a lot of storytelling with it, there's a lot of history. And then she gets into her own like paranormal investigating in the introduction. And I thought that was a really nice model. So mine is like a little bit of like cemetery history and my own learning about like the history of the American cemetery and how grief and death and dying have kind of changed over the years, especially in like American culture. I have two friends who are death doulas who helped me with like creating a glossary of like death terms, things that for the average reader who maybe isn't familiar with all of this stuff, even like pre-planning and what is grief defined as and things like that.
Mm.
So they helped me with that a little bit for kind of a like, again, a death positive view of things.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I didn't really think about that. But yeah, there is sort of like a language for a lot of
Mhm.
this stuff, right? That I guess maybe not the average person is aware of. So, yeah, I mean, there's just like so many different aspects. It's such a cool idea, and
Mhm.
there's just so many different aspects to it. But between obviously just getting some interesting recipes and
Yeah. Yeah.
learning about these people, I think a big part of it too is just like again, it's very interesting that you're meeting these people and doing all this stuff, but it's also still a cookbook, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I love cooking. I grew up around, a family that was constantly cooking, like the
Mhm.
most cliche. Dad had a pizzeria in New York. Like, I am very much a cliche Italian child, and would come home and someone was making pasta, or every summer we're canning tomatoes. Like that was my childhood basically. And I think what's so special about your book is that it's not like some chef on the Food Network, right? Like it's
Mhm.
just this one person from this one town, and this is like their specialty almost. You sort of mentioned, obviously there was this number, like you wanted 40 recipes. I guess I didn't really think about it until we started talking, but I guess there's not that many people putting recipes on their gravestones. Is that just like not that normal? Like I guess it seemed normal to me from seeing you post about it, but I guess it's difficult, right? Like not a lot of people are doing that.
Yeah, I mean, if you go like now, I've been to hundreds of cemeteries at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
They when you look at like the American gravestones, so in the early days, obviously they were made out of like wood, or people are just buried with like a really simple marker. And then once you get into like gravestone carvers, so originally were these stonemasons who had other jobs in addition to carving gravestones. And then over the years, it became more of a like profession of like it was the gravestone carver, and he would make tons and tons of the same. And that's why a lot of headstones, especially in like the New England area, because they had this one family that was a family of gravestone carvers. And so they would make a bunch of them. So they all look very similar and then ship them up, like up and down the East Coast or out to, different people who are burying community members. And so you can see like styles of like, oh, like you know who is like the old gravestone carvers family because they all have the same
That's
kind
so
of
cool.
mementos on them, and they're being hand carved too. And so history and time and technology have changed. Marble was popular for a really long time. It looks very beautiful. It's pretty easy to carve. It's very soft. And then, of course, now we know marble erodes fairly quickly. So, like in a lifetime, marble will just start to like get pretty decrepit. And now we have ability to carve granite. So most gravestones are made out of granite, and they're just much harder. They're much sturdier. You have to do it by machine, and because machines are carving it, it's a lot more easy to offer to a family member when someone's coming in and doing pre-planning or planning for a loved one who's passed, to be like, we have this like booklet of different types of memorials, different prices. It's priced per character, and you get to decide from that. And even now, beyond that, a lot of gravestone carvers. So I just talked to a woman named Julia who's in Minnesota at, I think it's Two Rivers Monuments, and she gets really personal. And I think she's becoming more of like this new generation of gravestone carvers that like whatever's important to you. And she does like fully like death doula planning with these families to be like, like let's talk about your loved one, and like let's do a little bit of like a Q&A about their life. And oh, they fed squirrels every day, like that's really important to them. Let's put a squirrel on their monument. And the
Yeah.
family, oh my God, yeah, like squirrels were so important to my mom.
Yeah.
When I visited her in her monument business, she was in the process of carving a squirrel, and she carves everything. She has it what looks like a little like tattoo gun,
Mm.
and like will like scratch onto the marble. And then, of course, for things like someone's name, things like that, they're machine done. And so you like put in whatever the text is that you want, and it scans it. But for something like a recipe, so the reason why I'd gotten connected to her is she had designed one gravestone recipe, and she was able to replicate the mother's handwriting from her recipe card. And so she hand drew the recipe card onto the
Whoa.
tombstone. It was
Wow.
so cool.
Yeah.
So I'd say, yes, yeah, still very rare. And also, I will add that these are all completely crowdsourced. So, like, there could be many more out there, but like, I'm reliant on families reaching out or people who visit cemeteries that might happen to post about it, or sometimes they'll send me one. We are getting into the territory of people have heard about the project and put their loved one's recipe because they had heard of other people doing this. And so I have three families who were just inspired. They're like, oh, I read about this TikToker doing this thing, and we heard about gravestone recipes. And I thought, wow, that's so cool. And so one family was like, oh, have you followed this girl on TikTok or Instagram? And I was like, yeah, I am that person. um, but I'm so glad for it. And like
Yeah.
they have had this really beautiful thing for their family that they were inspired by these other families who had done it. So it is becoming a little like chicken and the egg. And I'm hoping that more people, and again, it doesn't have to be a recipe, but it's the idea of like, oh, I don't have to just put like mother, father, or just like dates. And it can be like really take on the life of like, who was this person?
Yeah, what a cool thing to inspire people to do. I mean,
Yeah.
I just love the idea of getting creative with a gravestone, right? Like just go doing
Mhm.
anything sort of out of the norm, and whether it's adding a recipe or, a squirrel. I mean, that's so cool. I think, I guess maybe not everybody has the opportunity to do something like that, and it just sort of depends on how people want their body to be, what they want to do with their body after they're gone. But if that's an option, it's great that it's becoming an easier option for people to do. And yeah, hopefully this book will inspire more gravestone recipes. I mean, if you don't know off the top of your head, that's fine. But how, like, what's like the oldest recipe that you have for the book? Like, how far back does it go?
Not that far. So I am including people whose memorials also mention their recipe just for the sake of
Oh,
expansion.
cool.
There's
Yeah.
even honestly less than 40 because there's three people who their gravestone mentions their recipe, but their actual recipe is not written on it. And I should also add one reason why it's not as common is it's just pricey, especially if you're paying per character. That's a
Sure.
pricey monument.
Yeah.
And it is obviously based on location. So like ones in Arkansas are going to be cheaper than in Los Angeles or wherever.
Yeah.
But so the oldest one that is being featured in the book is Joe Sheridan, who is actually the inventor of or he's credited as the inventor of the Irish coffee. And
Oh,
he was
cool.
in Ireland, and has this like really funny story of a bunch of people came out on this flight and it was freezing, and someone was like, can you just make them a beverage to like warm them up? And it was basically the ingredients of Irish coffee. It was like, this creamed milk and coffee and Irish whiskey. And there was a food writer on the plane, and this guy was like obsessed, and he wrote this like story back to New York, and he was like, oh my gosh, I had the Irish coffee and it's so good. And then like everyone in the US started talking about Irish coffee, and then this guy in San Francisco who was a restaurant owner heard about it and was like, we need that here. And so he flew Joe out to San Francisco, and him and Joe and the food writer eventually recreated the Irish coffee, and now is like this like famous, whatever restaurant. They make it with Tullamore Dew Irish whiskey. And so Joe died and was buried in the 70s, and his gravestone says he gave the gift to the world his Irish coffee recipe. And so since we have his recipe, and I'm like, that's just such a fun nod.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
including him. And the restaurant let me use their Irish coffee recipe. And like, we've gotten into the California State Archives, and it's been a whole fun process.
Yeah.
And
That's
as
so
far as the
cool.
actual recipe, 1996, I believe, is the oldest one. So really, none of these are that old. Again, a little bit going off of like modern gravestone trends and technology. And
Yeah.
the one from 96 is like one of the, I call them like the like almost like Holy Trinity, or like the original three, which is Naomi K. Andrews, who has a fudge recipe, and Maxine Menster, who has her Christmas cookies recipe. And each of them have like gone viral way before I came along. Like if you were to Google any of these women, they were on different Reddit groups. They had been featured on a million different Facebook groups.
Oh, cool.
So they had already like permeated the internet. And I think some of the families, as I've been interviewing them, were like, oh, I saw this thing on Facebook about this woman who said like, you're gonna have my recipe over my dead body. And they were like, that's funny. We're gonna do that with our person too.
It's so funny too. It's like, oh, not that old, and oh, it's 1996, but 1996 is kind of old now.
Yeah, these days, oh boy, we're aging ourselves, and
I know,
absolutely.
I know. It just you said 1996, and I'm like, yeah, how long ago is
Yeah,
1996?
it's been a minute.
It's yeah, further than I would like it to be.
Yeah.
My brain just went to 1996, and I forgot what I was going to ask you.
Playing Nintendo, you're drinking Go-Gurt.
Oh my gosh, yes, so much Nintendo and Pop Tarts. I saw a
Yep.
Pop Tart the other day, and I was like, man, that just makes me feel like a child. I don't know when the last time you had a
Hey, you can put
Pop
a
Tart
Pop
was.
Tart and a Nintendo on your gravestone. Who knows?
I kind of love that. A Pop Tart kind of looks like a
It
gravestone.
honestly does.
All right, so it seems like obviously this is like a process getting it. It seems like you're very close towards the end. Oh, I know what I was going to ask you. Before we get into it, you recently posted something about recipes in obits, right? Is that like a thing? Did you not
Mhm.
post about that recently? You
I
did, right?
did, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And I originally, I mean, the project itself, I now have enough recipes, but when I was first starting this out, and I was like, what are just different ways that recipes have been featured in other like death memorials, and like
yeah,
there's a pretty common thing too that I've been hearing of people at like a funeral to hand out either prayer cards or a funeral pamphlet with someone's recipe in it. And
mm,
quite a lot of the families have mentioned that doing that for their person. And also it's just a lot cheaper and easier
yeah,
and
sure, sure,
accessible to
sure.
do it that way. And so the Washington Post had an article saying like, oh, there's thousands of casserole recipes. And I did look through their sources for that article, and I actually couldn't find that many casseroles. So that's kind of where it had started, of being like,
Mm,
oh, if there's only like in the beginning of 5 to 10 gravestone recipes, then I was like, maybe I'll expand to learning about like recipes and obituaries. And so I went through Legacy, and I come pretty thoroughly. I mean, this was just like a few hour first pass, but I found about 60 recipes on that, and still very dessert heavy, which is common for gravestone recipes too. Lots of things that like, comfort foods when people miss their parent or their aunt or their grandmother or whoever. And so, yeah, like obit recipes, I mean, when you make sense because it's so much easier to feature it there. And obituaries are very easy to find online. And
Yeah.
I don't know what the like longevity of an online obituary is. I mean, obviously they get put into different archives and newspaper archives, but legacy.com, which I think is paired with Ancestry, very easy to find people's obituaries. So that's been a huge source for me for learning about these people is first finding their obituary online and then using that to contact families. And so there's something about yeah, I don't know, in an obituary, which doesn't have to have that many details, but some obituaries are just so fun and they're just such a like piece of this person. And if you find a recipe in it, like absolutely genius.
Did you ever see there was a documentary called Obit, and it was about the New York Times obituary writers. Have you ever seen that before?
No, I'm looking that up immediately. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's really good. I actually had I think it was like maybe one of the first like 10 or 15 episodes I did was I wish I can't remember her name. I got to look it up, but uh yeah, she made this incredible documentary
Oh
and
my gosh, okay. I'm also going to listen to that
yeah,
episode.
it was definitely in the beginning. I would love to go back and listen to it. I think I was still figuring out how to interview people at that point, but I just love the documentary yeah, I think you would really like that.
Incredible.
Um it does seem like a lot of the recipes are comfort or dessert pretty much. Is there anything
Mhm.
in your book? Like does anybody have like a pasta recipe or like is there anything besides dessert in the book?
There are a few savories, enough that we have a very slim like savory section.
Yeah.
So there's one woman, one of the other gravestone recipes that's not an actual recipe, but it was just too good of a gravestone not to include.
Yeah.
And it's a woman named Beverly who's buried in Texas, and her gravestone says she made the world's best meatloaf.
I
And
love it.
the gravestone or that gravestone inspired a cookbook for the cemetery, which
Oh, well.
Ronfell, they basically did this like crowdsourced cemetery cookbook and it helped to just like fund preservation work. And they mostly feature her recipe. The woman who put it together was like a distant cousin of the family. So she was able to get Beverly's recipe. And so I talked to their family. And anyway, so we're going to have a meatloaf recipe, which is fantastic. It is a really good meatloaf
Yeah.
recipe.
I love
And
that.
I mean, yeah, no, it's so good. We have a few cheese dips. Dips in general are much easier. And I think a little
Okay.
bit on some level, I mean, obviously, in addition to just like a sweet treat and like a really like enjoyable dish to remember someone, I think baked goods, particularly cookies, make for very easy recipes. There's a book that's on the history of the American cookie, and the author of it talks about how if you look at like US cookies, it's a lot of like gather ingredients, mix in the bowl, bake. And so
Yeah.
like it's really forgiving instructions. You don't need a lot of details to it. So I think that again, for the sake of character space, makes it easier. Like,
Yeah.
these aren't steak tartare or things that like just need or lasagna, things that need so many details to them. But that being said, my recipe is in it also at the very end. And I have my own reflection on like my pre-planning. Um, I'm working with Congressional Cemetery where I interned at to buy a plot there, mostly because they're running out of space. And they have like been so down for me to like use this as like an educational process of like talking about buying a plot or whatever you want to do for your own pre-planning.
Yeah.
And I have my clam pasta linguine as like a recipe to kind of like tie off the end of the book.
I love that. That's so great. Very, very cool. Yeah, I guess that makes sense, right? Simple, like you said, add ingredients, mix sort of thing.
Yep.
Eventually, I feel like there'll be like digital headstones and there'll be like a video of somebody like teaching you how to.
Yeah, yeah, that's been cool to see too, the like QR codes. I am
Yeah,
curious, I had
yeah,
a lot of discussions with people because I am seeing QR codes pop up more and more, and
yeah,
I love the idea of them. I am nervous about the technology of like how much, like how dated is that going to be of like, right now QR codes are everything, especially
sure.
coming out of COVID. But that being said, I'm seeing even more of like there'll be the actual headstone and there'll be like a small marker in front, so like just separate from the headstone, and that has a QR code with like videos and like a website that family members manage. And that I think is a genius idea because it doesn't tie like, if QR codes become obsolete, it's
Yeah,
not like it's to the headstone. But also, I guess on a technology side, that is kind of fun for like imagining like people 100 years from now trying to be like, how do we access this QR code? I need to see the video.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't know, everyone is always like, "Oh, the internet's forever," but it's kind of not
No,
forever.
yeah, it's so impermanent. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm so excited for your book. I know I saw you post again something in the sense of like you're 3 drafts in now? Is that where we're at?
Yeah, 3 drafts in, and it's been a very non-linear process. My very kind, poor patient book editor. The draft one was due basically in January, but again,
Yeah.
because of that timeline that I'm trying to not pressure the families to get edits back to me at any time. And so
Yeah.
basically, after I had gotten the initial approval from each family member, I sent them the draft first before I sent it on, just to make sure the details look, if I was missing anything, whatnot.
Yeah.
And so some of the families have had the draft since last spring, which again, like these things take time, and trying to summarize up like your beloved mom in a few paragraphs is impossible. I'm already asking them to do the impossible. And so, or, some of the families we've been working back and forth on drafts, and sometimes, a new family member will chime in later in the process and being like, oh, I was just thinking we should probably mention this. So we are technically moving ahead, but I already have a list of new edits from family members to sneak into the copy editing process. So
Yeah.
we will probably keep making edits till like until the very last minute,
Yeah.
just because of the nature of, yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, it's just the nature of like legacy of a person. Like, there's always going to be more details. Even when the book comes out, I'm assuming it won't be perfect. I'm assuming there'll be things I leave out.
Yeah.
And so all I can say is we're trying our best to do this as like thoughtfully with everyone included. And so we'll see in the end what it looks like.
Well, I'm very excited to see the end product and to get myself a copy.
Yay, thank
And
you.
where could people go? Where should people go if they want to follow, if they want updates on the book, and where's the best place to get all of that information?
People can follow me, Ghostly Archive, on TikTok while it's still around. We'll see. With
Yeah,
the 90-day expirations coming up, and Instagram in the meantime. And I am working slowly to build up a website,
cool.
to have just something non-social media for people to follow along. But in the meantime, TikTok and Instagram, Ghostly Archive.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. It's always fun to talk to you, and you're such a great follow online, and I love seeing everything you're doing. And yeah, I'm so glad that we got to chat again.
Oh my gosh, me too. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm already making notes of former episodes of yours. I'm going to go back and listen to. Yeah. So thanks. Thanks
Very
again.
cool. Yeah, of course. Thanks so much.